Fine, we'll get started. Welcome to session 3C. Thank you for diving into archives, engaging K-12 teachers in place-based archival instruction. We have four amazing speakers today. We first have Alexandra Chassanoff.
Yes.
Alex is an assistant professor at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC-Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on community engagement and digital cultural heritage. Elliott Kuecker is a teaching assistant professor at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC-Chapel Hill. He's also the coordinator of the Archive and Records Management track and director of Masters of Professional Science in Digital Curation and Management. His research focuses on children's rights and archival pedagogy. Elliott Grimes is a PhD student at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC-Chapel Hill. You're sensing a theme. Her research focuses on trauma and harm in library settings with an emphasis on the perspective of patrons. And finally, Gabi Benedit is an MSLS student at the, you guessed it, School of Information and Library Science at UNC-Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on community-centered, decolonial, and trauma-informed cultural heritage outreach, education, and conservation practices. Please join me in welcoming them. Where's yours?
All right. Everyone hear me okay? All right. Let me just figure out this. There we go. All right.
The camera hasn't been put at the bottom. Sorry. That's what I know.
Well, thank you everybody for coming to the session. Today we're going to talk about our project, diving into archives as a generally to introduce the project, and then we're going to talk specifically about one of the workshops that we just gave a couple of weeks ago related to trying to connect high school educators with archival collections, and that's kind of the focus of the project. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics. After we talk about the workshop, we're going to talk after we talk about planning and recruitment, we're going to talk about some of the design lessons and that we did for both digital and physical materials. And we'll conclude by talking about some of our lessons learned and the feedback that we've gotten from our workshops, and just kind of trying to address, we're leaving a lot of time for questions because we think this is a very, we have a lot to share about sort of like how we did it, how you might want to do it differently, those kinds of insights. So the project, diving into archives, which is a broad project, began out after I had taught for a couple of semesters at North Carolina Central University. And I did these two very different projects in my classroom. One was on the left-hand side, you can see a digital collection called Historic Hayti. And in that project, students learned to research the history of a place, Hayti in Durham, North Carolina, that has largely been destroyed in sort of physical location, but the materials that exist are really fascinating. There's a rich history there located at the North Carolina collection at the Durham Public Library. And so in that class, students had the opportunity to take primary sources and make history or make historical assertions using primary sources. So it's sort of like a little bit of literacy, a little bit of archives, a lot of sort of trusting where your instincts would tell you to go, but also learning about how you navigate archives. It was a little bit of an experimental pilot project, but what I noticed is that students really hung on to the idea of place, and that especially for knowing kind of locations, being able to say, okay, I pass that place every day on my way home. That was really, that I saw in this photograph, and this is what it looked like 40 years ago. That was really powerful. And I had a similar experience in the second project, which was is called Hacking into History. And that is a project on racial covenant deeds, which is another collection that is Durham based. It's government record, public records, basically a collection of property deeds that are at the Register of Deeds office. And many people are now working on similar types of projects too. Again, when we brought that, I did a pilot project where we worked with Durham public school teachers to get this into their curriculum. And it was, that's an entirely different presentation that I could talk about, but I will say learned a lot from that experience and tried to sort of address it in doing the design of the bigger project. So, but the sort of takeaway from that project for me was that students, again, really responded strongly and significantly to seeing deeds of places that they recognized. So I started to get curious about place-based approaches, and the larger project, which I was lucky enough to receive funding for upon starting at SILS last fall, 2023, was sort of getting, using place-based approaches or to think about place-based concepts, which are largely in the historical public history space, and thinking about how archives might adopt some of these strategies or whether they might be helpful. And so my kind of big research questions were, how can we connect K through 12 educators with primary sources? It seems like a really meaningful exercise, right? We were just talking about this a second ago. We have high aspirations for being able to give people access to the rich documents themselves. And this is something that the AHA is, now kind of clearly demonstrating and finding in their reports that there's really powerful, meaningful work happening with source materials, but that we're losing the context. And so, I put up this quote here: in the typical document-based lesson, sources come disembodied from their original context and in heavily excerpted formats. So those are the sort of lesson plans that get created by the AHA, by other kinds of non-archival entities. And so my question is, how can we contribute to this conversation? There's already some work happening with the TWP initiative, and certainly there's a lot of work to be done. But for our purpose, we specifically wanted to create a workshop using and sort of emphasizing the uniqueness of the North Carolina collection, where people were they're digitizing a whole bunch of stuff right now, and there's just really unique, interesting oral histories that many historians are scrambling to learn about and are so excited because a lot of the richness in these regional collections has not been widely available prior to this. So the goal of the project is really to understand broadly about K through 12 education as a kind of population, to try to understand how they might use those primary sources from a needs perspective. So where are their gaps? Where are their disconnects? How can we, as a profession, help support that work? So far we've launched an online survey for North Carolina K through 12 educators. And then we did a pilot workshop that we planned starting in the fall. And that concluded, we held that the 24th of April. Is that right? Just 3 weeks ago. So that was a really, small scale pilot workshop to design lessons for using some of those collection materials. And that's what we're going to spend a lot more time talking about. And then the next thing we're also talking about as part of the broader project, diving into archives, conducting focus groups to really connect with K through 12 educators and to talk with them directly. And so now I will turn it over to my colleague, Gabi, to talk about workshop planning.
Hello, everyone. As Dr. Chassanoff mentioned, this has been this project has kind of been in the works since the fall, and I joined the team in the spring. But over the fall, there was a lot of research on the collections that we might be using and mapping to North Carolina teaching standards. And those standards, that was something that was worked on as part of the Hacking into Histories project. And my colleague Lyric used this info to kind of select what collections we were going to use for a workshop. And as well as establishing like our general project goals and timelines. When I came on in the spring, there we began to kind of refine what each of our role would be throughout the rest of this project and all the other projects that we have in the mix, and started working on lesson plans. We developed one lesson plan for physical collections and one lesson plan for digital collections, and you're going to hear more about that in a bit. We also worked on just our general day of needs and agenda. Do we need to figure out parking? Do we need to selecting a conference room? Making sure that we have the materials available for everyone, and working on outreach more specifically. So that portion, our recruitment, we began by commissioning this gorgeous little Diving into Archives logo, and created this flyer, as well as a Google form application for instructors to fill out and let us know. We had just general questions like contact information, what grade level they're teaching, what they hope to, how they're currently using, if they are using primary sources in the classroom, and what their goals are for the outcome of the project. And what we got from those responses was that there's kind of a mix. There are some instructors who are struggling to incorporate primary sources. There are some that have a desire to do more. There are some that are actively doing the best that they can. And when answering about their goals for this workshop, they wanted to connect with other teachers. They wanted to find more accessible primary source collections that they can work with, and improve their own teaching practices. We planned our participant communications. So from this form to confirmation emails, to reminder emails, to like a day of consent form and exit ticket. And we began to share more widely online, primarily on LinkedIn, and through our connections that we had within the Durham public school system. And yeah, we're trying to get creative in new avenues of recruitment, going to our local coffee shops, like asking our friends, texting other folks. And yeah, concluding with collecting our application form responses. And we ended up having 8 participants, I believe 8 participants come to the workshop. And it was a fun group. You'll hear more about that next. But now I will turn it over to my colleague Lyric, who will tell you more about the lesson planning.
All right, so I handled the planning for the digital materials for this workshop. And so going into this, I really wanted to take a step back and take a broader approach about like, who are we working with? What would they want? And so in my mind, I work better if I take more of like a simple approach. So I kind of took a basic like who, what, where, when, and why type of approach. And so these are kind of, I'm going to walk you through my process of how I did this. So some of the considerations and guiding questions, very first, who are we working with? For this project, it was K through 12 educators, but then I took a step further to say, who do they work with? And it's students. So after that, I moved to what would they want? So what would 12 through K, K through 12 educators want, but what would the students want? So like when I was a high school student, when I was 5 years old, whatever, what would I want to see in a classroom or a lesson plan using these materials? So thinking about that, K through 12 educators did some of this mapping earlier, like Gabi talked about. They would want some of that mapping to the North Carolina social studies standards. On the left side of the screen, that AHB 1.2, that's one of the standards they use. So I kind of went through like a methodical process to say, okay, if I use this, what standard would this match if they use it in the classroom? But then on the flip side, I said, as a student, what would I want to see? I'd want to see something that's probably engaging, that's thought-provoking. I put combinable, that's more of an educator standpoint. Like I could take this and maybe use it in an art history class where I could like make my own postcard, or counter narratives that could go for either side of like this is what we're presenting, but here might be the other side that you're not seeing. So kind of thinking about those wants and needs. There's more, but this is a small slide. So we move. The when and the where, this was kind of a little bit more difficult, but just thinking, okay, when are we going to use this? Where are we going to use this? It's an online digital archive. It's digital archive. So it's kind of anywhere in a classroom, but more importantly, how can they access this? So like what's easily accessible, what can you get to pretty easy? That's the Durham Public Library, North Carolina collection, digital archive. Then after that, I moved on to the how. So I took more of a how would they use this collection rather than like a how, general how. So as a librarian, as a PhD student, I thought about in collection selection and how they would use this. I thought about themes. So in this collection, what themes am I saying? Am I saying, like, if you look at the postcard, themes of like social life, North Carolina history, landmarks, like what themes, how could they use those things? I also thought about collection features. I just put the postcard on this slide because it's the most visually interesting to look at. Excuse me. But what collection features are you saying? Are you saying like postcards? Is there AV material? Is there handwritten letters? That type of things that you can get different elements out of that your educators and your students could work with. And last but not least, I kind of talked about this already, but was NC standards. Those are going to be more important for your educators so that they're more aware of how this lesson plan or this material can be easily mapped to what they need to hit in their teaching. Last but not least, in my own studies, I've been learning a lot about backwards design. So thinking about how do I get to this end goal from this process rather than thinking it from the front way, if that makes sense. So on the left, I kind of already went through, that was kind of like my end result. Like if I chose the North Carolina postcard collection, these are the themes I saw, these are the features, and this is a criteria I could map it to. So moving on, designing the lesson plan itself, kind of again, some similar considerations that I thought about when planning the lesson plan was populations if we're working with K through 12 students. Yet again, I kind of mentioned backward designing earlier, but I've also been learning a lot about active learning. So when I was a student, what was the ways I could be active? Where were some ways I could get some hands-on type of learning rather than just sitting and being lectured at? Because I always find that boring. So I thought maybe the students would also find that boring. So what are some ways we can get it active and get some brain juices flowing? After that, I also thought about inclusivity. This kind of also goes with that counter narrative point I mentioned. We'll get to this question later, but I specifically chose this postcard because some of those counter narratives and some of the things what you can get at. So that guiding question at the bottom, what can a postcard tell us? If you look at the C of Carolina, you see that it is an enslaved person picking cotton. You know, we don't need to erase that history. It is part of our history and it can teach us a lesson. So using the postcard, what does this tell us about North Carolina history? What does it tell us that at that time we thought was important? So kind of like that inclusivity, telling all stories. Then moving on to the last consideration and guidance was the backwards design outcomes. So in this lesson plan, what did I want students to get from it? So that was digital literacy. How can they use this online archive to find materials, to learn about North Carolina history, and those important things, NC standards, how can those educators use this to get to their standards? And finally, I work better if I have something easy to remember, so I call it R. Is it adaptable? Can this be adapted to different contexts? Is it revisable? Kind of the same thing. Can they change it to suit their needs? And is it extendable? So after this is done, can they take it and apply it to something else? Or can you keep taking this lesson forward? So yeah, next.
Okay, so Lyric did that digital archive lesson plan because that's probably the most accessible way that K through 12 teachers are going to encounter archives in the classroom. But we also wanted to do a physical lesson plan because when we read the literature on primary source and engage teaching with these things, just handling the materials right is very appealing. So we did want to account for this. The other thing is that since we were using a public library archive, field trips and other things like that are actually possible for these students. So there's a chance that they could actually come handle such materials. So for the physical lesson plan, I did try to emphasize that thing that we can't really get at with the digital primary sources, which is just the pleasure of handling objects, right? And I also wanted to select something kind of surprising because a lot of the times when you read the guidance on what to use in a classroom from the archives, it's a lot of things from like wars, you know, or like major events. So I was pondering and working with some of the things that Lyric also agreed, like had picked out that were very fascinating and specific to the North Carolina collection. Like what's a kind of everyday mundane piece of history from this local place? And one of the things that we were able to locate was these debutante balls. And so we actually used two different collections. One was debutante balls really for basically the white community. It's materials like these yearbooks that they made specific for the debutantes, advertisements in newspapers, those kinds of things are in the collection. And then the other ones, it's a sorority, but it's for high school girls, mostly Black girls. And it is called the Jabberwocks, is another term for their sorority. And so they had similar things, yearbook type materials, newspaper articles, event, flyers, those kinds of things. So Gabi and I went to the North Carolina collection in the reading room at the Durham Public Library, and we actually handled the materials to see what really is here. They have good finding aids, but the charm of these materials really wasn't handling them and seeing them. They're also very contemporary. They're still releasing these, so they went all the way to maybe 2016 is like the point they had them, and it went back to mid 20th century. So it was something that I think most teachers wouldn't expect to find. Quite place-based as well, because you can see in each of these yearbooks, the women's family names, the volunteer places, the churches they go to, all things around Durham, kind of similar to postcards, but totally different material type. And so we again connected the outcomes for the lesson and the activities we were going to do to that state curriculum. And the North Carolina state curriculum for high school classes and social studies and history and things like that actually do focus a lot on social status. So using these two different kinds of yearbooks, these two different kinds of programs for young kind of coming of age girls to women programs work really well with the kinds of things that they're sometimes expected to teach in the classroom. They also do say things about teaching about everyday people and everyday lives, and women's history is one of the elements as well. So this hit on a lot of those. There's just a little image you can see of an example. A lot of what you see in this kind of collection is like ball gown type, people really dressed up and celebrating. So one thing I'll add is when the teachers handled these things, they were indeed surprised just as much as we thought. But some of them even were like, I think I had her as a student, which is something I hadn't thought about. So it brought up a privacy thing I hadn't considered with this material type. It wasn't that anything in these were embarrassing. They're very celebratory of the young women, but that is a consideration I realized we haven't talked about. When it's place-based and it's local and the people who are there are also local, just one element. And sort of brings to some of the takeaways. That was one takeaway that I had from that specific instance of people recognizing some of the women in the photos. But there's quite a lot of takeaways we had after doing this and things that we would definitely change. One of the things we learned is that making contact with teachers is actually quite difficult. Very difficult audience to reach, even though there's so many of them, and you think of it as like an accessible, almost like a government worker, but their emails and things like that are obscured online. It's hard to contact them directly. Sometimes Gabi, doing our outreach, had to call schools and ask for contacts. And so without having a teacher on our team, which is an advantage that Dr. Chassanoff had, some of the other iterations, the earlier stages of the project, we realized that we had a problem. We needed an insider. Even though we had friends and connections, it was so much work just to do the outreach. We also overestimated how much teachers might already know about archives. We kind of expected them coming into this with a level of knowledge that I think they had a little bit less than we expected. So an example is that they were really shocked that digital collections were just at URL. They might ask questions like, is this password protected? I don't have a library card. Can I still look at it? So we didn't include enough 101 information We did include some about handling physical objects, but I think we could have done more one-on-one information. And so we would greatly change the way we spend our time in a workshop in the future with that audience. We also realized that they had some ideas about what archivists do, especially regarding like things like gatekeeping. A couple of the people in the session have experiences trying to do research at the Rubenstein, which is the Duke Special Collections. And they were like, if you're not a student or a registered researcher or have a fellowship there, like you can't get in. Why do archivists do this? And it wasn't like a bashing session. It was a very good learning experience of them thinking that it was a kind of exclusive world. And so we realized that could be a major part of the outreach, is just explaining what archives are, what kinds of priorities do archivists have, access being something. And I think they also almost had a sort of us versus them mentality, and we realized, you know, archivists and teachers have a lot in common, and that would be something great to emphasize in future workshops. They did not want really the lesson plans that we gave exactly. So as Lyric mentioned, trying to be adaptable and flexible, we made these lesson plans that you could put probably across a couple different grades, different disciplines, and you could change the materials out and still basically get at the same point and do the activities the same way. In fact, our lesson plans even had like long and short options, depending on if you have like a 50-minute class or you do it for a couple days or something. But when we read the feedback in our exit ticket, we found that they wanted lesson plans that were very much just plug and go, immediately use. And some of their feedback even said like, well, none of these were for English, so how would I even do that? So we thought these are flexible. They weren't what they were looking for exactly. Yeah, that we mentioned the subject specific, and some of the subjects that they brought up were even a little bit surprising, like science. We do know that, of course, people can use primary sources in the sciences, but that was specific feedback that they gave us that they wanted. And we also thought of the idea of maybe one way to sort of meet their expectations with what we were hoping to do is if we created lesson plan templates that they filled in, because we were having so much trouble guessing their needs, that maybe what we offer in a better way could be a framework, and then they fill in some of those gaps rather than us making these lesson plans that they didn't feel were adaptable to their context. So there's a lot of successful things. We did correctly identify that teachers were quite interested in primary sources in the classroom, but that they need a lot of support to make this happen. And they even want a social element. More time just talking together would have been a great change. The Public Library History Room partnership is a great collaboration. Many of the teachers mentioned we could actually bring our students here, even though they've done away with so many field trips and funding. We could come here and do this. So they were excited about the Public Library partnership idea. Teachers enjoyed just being in the space together and discussing the topic of archives. So maybe more open-ended questions and facilitation of discussion, something we could do, but we did do a good job at least bringing them together, right? So that one was kind of a little bit here and there. And we did find that they were interested in both the digital and physical. So we were kind of right about suggesting that we wanted to show them things that they could handle, and they were curious and excited about that. But ultimately, a lot of them will probably need digital collections. So we feel that we would repeat that and offer examples of both in the future again. Some of the feedback, just if you wanted to see some quotes, we did ask them what they learned. We got so many ideas from other educators about integrating primary sources, especially into the ELA classroom. So that was interesting. Somebody talking about English as a second language. We asked the question, what still makes you nervous about using these? And so they brought up AI. Want to know, as AI increases, how to know myself and teach my students to check for the authenticity of primary sources, especially more modern ones like social media posts. So they want to know about finding a primary source out of context and addressing authenticity, which is something archivists could indeed teach and deal with all the time. So that was kind of exciting. And what they found helpful was just connecting in that interpersonal aspect and a little something they could take with them. We did print our lesson plans, and we also put them on the library website as well.
Sorry, just the
What?
the PowerPoint.
Oh, the formatting.
Oh, got all right. Yeah.
Ah,
That's us.
I thought it was an abstract.
There, that is us, there we are.
Well, this is your link to cubism.
That's it. Well, so, yeah, all of our contact information is here, and, yeah. But we also have time, I think a lot of time for questions.
Oh, yeah, we still have about half the session, a little over half a little under half the session.
And so we can talk about more specifically certain things or answer questions.
You talked about the professional development sessions that you did for the teachers. Did you offer, or I guess through the school district, offer that as continuing education credits so that they could count that towards maintaining licensure?
Yeah, so in my pilot to this project, I did do that. And so that worked out really well. The problem with that project overall, I think, timing in both cases was significantly impacted, I think, the participation of people. So we got a lot of people interested and ready to commit to the first project. About 100 people came to our first workshop, and everyone was very excited about the CEUs, the continuing education credits, and we had buy-in from the teacher that was working with us, had also gotten buy-in from the administration, right, to get the continuing ed credits. But that project took place in 2021, and as the time kind of between the workshops, COVID just got worse and worse, or plateaued and kind of went through different intensity moments. So we had people participating fully at first and then less so. And I feel like this project also kind of came the week. We had our recruitment starting the week after the Department of Education cuts were announced. And so there was a lot of, I feel like potentially people might have been more interested, but we didn't do CEU credits for this one. I think that's something that we would want to add next time. But it was a little bit different because that was a three sessions design, so it really was thoroughly very continuing ed. We had a cohort. People got received stipends for participating. That answer.
This is amazing. We have met, but I'm at the Digital Heritage Center at Carolina. And so place-based history is like, love it. Do you have plans to do this with more public library, local history collections, like at other places in the state, or plans for?
We would like to. I mean, so the collections you work with were hugely significant for the Hayti project, as you know. So, I mean, that really was it blew my mind that we could actually get access to those kinds of sources. And so trying to make this more a part of our regular, I think we had hoped that our workshops would become regular at the Durham Public Library. We haven't really talked beyond.
We also thought about, and because of the outreach obstacle that we have, it might be easier if we went to them. There's a couple conferences for teachers in the state of North Carolina, and of course educators across the nation at large. I have actually presented at a teachers conference in Georgia before and found that there wasn't trouble getting people because the conference is handling those workshops, and so all we have to do is prepare well. And so we talked about next year planning doing that instead. Yeah.
Now we have 2 other questions in the room, but we do have a virtual question that I want to make sure we get to. What did they say? It popped up and went away.
Okay. Caitlin is asking, how would you counter concerns of educators and library staff of students handling materials, of children specifically handling materials?
Yeah, I actually don't think there would be any problem with that because of how children take seriously sort of boundaries that you might put in place. And something interesting about like teaching the rituals of handling materials, like wash your hands, these are very special. I actually think that children might be better than some of the teachers we had, which were like, look at this person and passing things back and forth. We realized that like we hadn't gone through the rules in a really over the top way because we made assumptions about adults. But I feel like, not in a negative way, that was like our bad, right? But I think that children, like just coming from it as someone who works with some children and child research and has children, I think about how careful they are when you tell them something's important. So I would actually have no nervousness about that. Yeah.
And I know there's two more hands.
I had two questions. Number one, how concerned were the high school teachers about where this experience with the students fit on the EOCs? But it's all about the test. And I got to remember the other question, sorry. But yeah, I mean, because I know the test rules. And so how did they match that up with what they're going to be tested on, or did they?
They didn't mention tests, but they did mention some specific things about curriculum. Like for example, one of them brought up that they do a whole section on Holocaust studies, which could also mirror aspects of the testing, like about history testing. So they have things in mind, I think, that are the cornerstones of like what they would want to hit on, which weren't exactly our examples, but I felt like they were okay with the idea of like, we might choose different materials. We did bring up the fact that they would perhaps use Library of Congress or National Archives or other sources beyond the small space, but the nation as a place. So I think that we could expand which digital collections we're getting examples from, for those things on tests.
And the other question was, have you taught with the North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching? Do you know them? They're located in Cullowhee. They're under DPI. And they also have a location on Ocracoke, and it does week-long seminars. It used to be really creative, like lifelong learners trying to keep teachers in the classroom, doing all kinds of creative things. But now it's primarily staff development, national boards, certifications. But that would be a way. I mean, they book the people, and you go to Cullowhee or you go to Ocracoke. But this is the kind of experience that they might be very interested in.
So can you say the name again, just so I can?
It's called NCAT, North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching. Western Carolina is the home base, but it's under DPI, they're state funded.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful.
That's fantastic.
Thank you for that.
Do you know Christy?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about y'all's experience working with the standards, like the teaching standards. Did you find it more prohibitive, restrictive, or did you find that it kind of gave you a framework that made it easier to make lesson plans, or either of those things?
They're looking at me. So just to go back, I actually, I didn't think it was, I hate to say it, I didn't think it was anything really. I just went in and chose what I thought was interesting to me. And then it was pretty easy. Like if you look at this description, it's pretty open and pretty vague. So like the debutante balls one, like one of the standards was just women's history, and like there's women in the picture, there you go. One of there's like a lot of archives about like farming or like Duke records, and like there's literally a curriculum I think about sports or affluency. So it was very easy to kind of like choose what I thought was interesting and what students would like, and then kind of map it to it. So that's I guess one of the good things about American education. It's very vague. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I thought I mentioned before the panel that my wife's an educator. She was a science teacher for 15 years now. She's a visually impaired teacher. Visually impaired students. And she mentioned Wake County, Raleigh. One of the challenges they've had recently with several administrative rule changes is that individual teachers no longer have as much adaptability for their lesson plan that every assignment had to be approved by the board or by central office or a parents group to verify there was nothing objectionable in the assignment. And that took away a lot of the flexibility to do activities like this unless you got buy-in from the county level. So have you all thought about ways to get in at, not the classroom, but to get in at the system level, like Orange, or Chapel Hill Carborough or Buncombe or something like that?
Yeah, that's what you.
So that was the plan when, for the Durham Public Schools. I started to feel a little uncomfortable with the project being introduced to classrooms without knowing that the teachers that were participating had some sort of protection given the change in climate. And so we actually did have, we spent at least 2 years trying to get the Durham Public School Administration, the county, to help us and meet with us. And they were very excited over and over again, and we never could get a meeting together. So and that was, I guess, why that project kind of went by the wayside, but it was a lesson learned. And I think it's possible public schools are just overwhelmed. I mean, that was sort of the takeaway that I got. Like, they weren't even able to get their buses funded. So like, we couldn't even have a conversation about something like this. So in general, I feel like that is what feels like, at least in Durham, the public schools, but we have talked about talking to charter schools, magnet schools, maybe broadening a little bit beyond the publicly funded only schools, which is kind of where my initial interest was. And that may be something that's a little easier to negotiate, but I think that's, in a perfect world, that would be the right way to approach this, to get the buy-in of the administrative powers that be and protection for the teachers.
I feel like we could get any system in the state to buy in, and it could be proof of concept. That might, because that's something that we thought about the state archives, is like, maybe we could work with a smaller rural county where it's just like one high school and a smaller subset, and even then we could, and maybe they don't have resources in the county, there's no repository in the county, so we can bring sources to them. And maybe we never got a chance to because we were planning it around COVID and it just fell apart. But maybe that's like, if there's a latch, and then if you have proof of concept, then you can go to those conferences and be like, see, Greene County, this was really great in this rural county that doesn't have resources. And that's just an example. There's a lot of rural counties that don't have repositories. Maybe it could work in a bigger county. Maybe. I wish you luck, and I want to help with it. I'm interested to see how we can help with the state archives. And I think, Chris at the Digital Heritage Center, I think any repository wants to be a part of this, especially like throughout the state. You can help with, your area. So like Pitt County, ECU, natural fit, but got to get that inroad.
And I think we could. I mean, my plan had been to, well, I feel like I'm full of bad news, but to sort of go for an IMLS grant around this the next year. But that will have to wait some time.
Waiting in the lobby. That was another question. You mentioned science earlier, so I wanted to mention an interesting assignment my wife actually built using our records at the state archives for science. She taught forensic science, and have you heard, there was a true crime case in the 1800s about Tom Dooley, who was a convicted murderer, and there's a ballad about him, the Ballad of Tom Dooley, and down your head, Tom Dooley, spelled D-U-L-A, became this Kingston Trio, big hit in the 60s. We have the records of that case at the state archives, and it's actually some of the earliest court exhibits survived from that case because it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So she had her students in their document unit read the handwriting first of all, and try to put the documents together, and then but then she would also take it a step further and have them look at the exhibits, like the maps of the crime scene, and say, here's what they decided in 1861 or 1866 based on the evidence. What would modern forensics do differently in this case based on the facts? Could we, because there's still, even though people think they know what happened, there's still some uncertainty in that case. And she was like, how could modern forensics actually help us? Like, where would DNA fit? And like, where could fingerprinting fit? And could we figure out this? And it's a crazy, complicated story involving a love triangle with cousins and syphilis and pregnancy and shallow graves. It's insane.
Like all the best stories.
But it gets high school students interested because it is insane.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to use actual records and connect it in. But it's a science class. So that's just an example of a science, a way to bring a historical record into science. Because that was one of the things you mentioned earlier. So there are ways.
That is a very cool way.
Yeah.
That's an awesome-
Forensics is a little bit easier of a subject. Because, the science is kind of interesting, and science is always interesting. But it's maybe easier to integrate records into a forensic science class than say like, astronomy. But maybe you have Moorhead Planetarium on campus. Maybe you have records of the earliest things at Moorhead, something like that. So. Anything else? Well, please join me in thanking our panel. The next up thing is the poster session. It'll start in a little. They might be over there already, but if not, 3 o'clock is when it officially starts. And then after that, we'll be going over to our reception downtown. Tomorrow is the SNCA business meeting and the workshops. And a reminder, if you have not signed up for a workshop, if you want to, there's still plenty of space in all 3.
Yes. But all.